There are some nights that never end. Not really. They stretch across decades, folding into the creases of memory, reshaping the lives they touch until those lives become unrecognizable. June 5th, 1986 was one of those nights. In a small mobile home in Lexington County, South Carolina, a mother tucked her children into bed, kissed their foreheads, and believed, as all parents do, that morning would come the way it always had. But morning arrived broken, a window shattered, a door left open, and a bed that should have held two little girls held only one. 4-year-old Jessica Suzanne Gutierrez vanished into humid southern darkness, carried away by hands that had no right to touch her. For 36 years, her name would hang in the air like an unanswered question, but after years of silence, a single clue would shatter everything. Before I tell you what happened, comment your country and time below. The summer of 1986 moved slowly through South Carolina, thick and heavy like syrup. It was a kind of heat that made people move differently, unhurried, deliberate conservation of energy written into every gesture. In Lexington County, where pine trees outnumbered streetlights and neighborhoods were measured in acres rather than blocks, life unfolded in the reliable rhythms of working-class America. People knew their neighbor, doors stayed unlocked, children played outside, until fireflies replaced the sun. Jessica Suzanne Gutierrez turned 4 years old on December 3rd, 1981. By the summer of 86, she was a bright-eyed child with dark hair and a smile that photographs couldn't quite capture, the kind that required motion, sound, the fullness of a moment to understand. She lived with her mother and siblings in a mobile home that served as the entire universe for a family doing what so many families do, making do, getting by, loving each other through the ordinary struggles that never make headlines until something unthinkable happened. The mobile home sat in a modest park where families lived close enough to hear each other's lives through thin walls, laughter, arguments, television shows bleeding into shared evening air. It wasn't much, but it was home. Inside, Jessica's world was small and knowable. Her mother's voice, her sister's presence in the bed they shared, the particular creak of their front door, the way light filtered through curtains in the morning. June 5th began like any other day, the kind of unremarkable Thursday that history only remembers in retrospect. Jessica played. Her mother worked through the domestic choreography of keeping a household running. Meals, laundry, the 1,000 invisible tasks that structure a child's sense of safety. There were no omen, no shadows creeping at the edges of the day, just ordinary time passing in ordinary way. As evening settled over Lexington County, the temperature dropped from unbearable to merely uncomfortable. Crickets began their nightly symphony. Through screen doors and open windows, the sounds of dinner and television created a collective soundtrack, American life in its most mundane, most precious form. Jessica's mother moved through her bedtime routine with the practiced efficiency of a parent who has done this 1,000 times before. Bath time, pajamas, stories perhaps, or song. The rituals that help children surrender to sleep. Jessica climbed into the bed she shared with her sister. 2 small bodies in one small space. The kind of arrangement that teaches children about comfort and proximity, about never being alone. Their mother kissed them goodnight, turned off the light, closed the door most of the way. In the living room, she settled into her own evening, unaware that she was living to the last normal moments of her life. The house grew quiet. Outside, the night deepened. Somewhere in that darkness, someone was moving with purpose. The precise timeline of what happened next would be reconstructed later, pieced together from evidence and absence, from what was found and what was missing. But in the moment, it unfolded in silence. No scream, no struggle loud enough to wake the household. Just the careful, calculated movements of someone who had planned this. The living room window shattered. Glass fell inward, a sound that should have been alarm. But in the deep hours of night, in a house where people slept the heavy sleep of the exhausted, it registered as something else. A crack, a pop, the distant noise of something happening in some other world. The human brain, desperate for comfort, has a remarkable ability to explain away the inexplicable. A car backfiring, something falling, anything but the truth. Through the broken window, hands reached in, a body followed. Someone entered a Gutierrez home with the kind of boldness that speaks to either familiarity or absolute conviction. They moved through the living room, a space they seemed to know, or at least to navigate with confidence, past furniture, past sleeping shadow, toward the bedroom where 2 children slept. The door opened. What goes through the mind of a child waking in darkness to hands that aren't their mother's? There's no language for it, no frame of reference, just confusion dissolving into fear, and fear having no time to become screams before consciousness blurs into movement, into being carried, into a nightmare that has broken through into the waking world. Jessica's sister would wake alone. That absent, the cold space where warmth should have been, would become her first memory of that morning. The moment of realization, something is wrong. The calling out, the searching, the small hand reaching across the bed, and finding nothing. By the time Jessica's mother understood what had happened, the front door was standing open, not broken, not forced, simply open, as if someone had every right to leave that way, as if they'd been invited in and were now taking their leave. The broken window told a different story. The empty bed told everything. The morning of June 6th, 1986, arrived with cruel normalcy. Sunrise came, birds sang, the world continued its rotation, indifferent to the hole that had been torn in one family's life. But inside the Gutierrez mobile home, time had stopped. A mother stood in her daughter's room, looking at the impression still visible on the pillow, the small indent where a 4-year-old head had rested hours before. Law enforcement arrived with sirens and urgency. The mobile home park, so quiet hours before, erupted into controlled chaos. Officers moved through the scene, photographing, measuring, documenting. The broken window, the open door, the bedroom where Jessica had been taken. Every surface became potential evidence. Every neighbor a potential witness. Had anyone heard anything? Seen anyone? Noticed a vehicle that didn't belong? The answers came back in fragments. Maybe this, possibly that. The uncertain testimony of people woken from sleep, asked to remember details from a night they've been unconscious through. In close quarters, you'd think someone would have heard something. But sound moves strangely in the night, absorbed by darkness and distance, and the mind's ability to filter out what it doesn't want to believe is happening. The investigation unfolded with the intensity that missing child cases demand. Lexington County law enforcement understood what every moment meant. They organized searches. Volunteers combed through woods and ditches, calling Jessica's name into the pine forest, hoping for an answer that never came. Dogs tracked scents that faded into nothing. Leads were pursued and exhausted. Known offenders were questioned. Alibis were checked and verified. But Jessica had vanished completely. Days became weeks. The initial surge of community energy, the searches, the vigils, the flyers taped to every available surface, began to fade, not from lack of caring, but from the slow recognition that this wasn't going to be resolved quickly. The story moved from front pages to inside section. The volunteers returned to their lives. The police continued working, but leads grew scarce. The physical evidence was maddeningly limited. The broken window, the open door, fingerprints lifted from the scene that would be run through every database available in 1986. But forensic science in that era had limitations that would be unthinkable today. DNA analysis was in its infancy. Databases were incomplete. Technology that would later revolutionize criminal investigation simply didn't exist yet. By autumn, as leaves began to fall and the South Carolina heat finally broke, the case file on Jessica Suzanne Gutierrez had grown thick with reports and thin on resolution. Active investigation transitioned into something else, not closed, never closed, but no longer urgent. Detectives moved on to new cases. The phone stopped ringing, and somewhere, a family learned to live in the space between hope and grief, unable to fully inhabit either. The case went cold. There is a particular kind of agony reserved for families of the missing, worse in some ways than the finality of death. Death offers closure, ritual, the permission to grieve, but disappearance exists in perpetual suspension. You cannot mourn because hope refuses to die. You cannot celebrate because joy feels like betrayal. You exist in limbo, marking time in a world that has moved on without you. For Jessica's mother, June 6th stopped being a date on the calendar and became a permanent condition. Every moment divided into before and after. Before the window broke, after her daughter vanished. The mobile home, once simply small, became suffocating. Every room held the echo of what had been lost. The bed that used to hold 2 girls. The toys that would never be outgrown. The clothes that would never be worn. She would learn, as all parents of missing children learn, that the world has no patience for prolonged grief. There is a cultural statute of limitations on sympathy. A few weeks, perhaps a few months, when people ask how you're doing and actually wait for an answer. But eventually the questions stop, not because people stop caring, but because they don't know what to say anymore. What comfort can be offered to someone living in permanent purgatory? The immediate family contracted around the wound. Jessica's sister, who had woken that morning to find her sister gone, carried her own particular burden. Survivor's guilt, though too young to name it. The irrational but persistent belief that she should have woken up, should have protected her sister, should have somehow prevented the unpreventable. She would grow up in the shadow of that night. Every milestone marked by the absence of the person who should have been there to share it. The community of Lexington County, so galvanized in those first days, slowly returned to normalcy, not from cruelty, but from necessity. Life demands to be lived. Bills must be paid. Children must be raised. The world's tragedies are endless, and human beings cannot hold them all simultaneously. But for those closest to Jessica, there would be no moving on, only moving through, day by day, carrying the weight of not knowing. The first anniversary arrived like a second trauma. June 6, 1987. 1 year since Jessica had been taken. Her mother marked it in private ways that would become annual ritual. A candle lit, a prayer spoken, photographs spread across the table. Jessica as a baby, Jessica at 3, Jessica at 4, forever 4. The community organized a remembrance. People came, stood in solidarity, promised not to forget. But the crowd was smaller than the year before. Time had already begun its erosive work. Birthdays were unbearable. December 3rd, each year marked what should have been. 5 years old, 6, 7, 8. Jessica's mother bought birthday cakes that wouldn't be eaten, wrapped presents that wouldn't be opened. Some years she couldn't bring herself to do even that. The day would simply pass in silent acknowledgement of all the celebrations that should have been. The Lexington County Sheriff's Office kept the case file open. Detectives changed over the years, but someone was always designated as the keeper of Jessica's case. Every few months, they would review the evidence again, run fingerprints through updated databases, check for similarities with other cases across state lines, called Jessica's mother to tell her they were still working, still searching, still hoping for a break. But as the years accumulated, 5, 10, 15. Even those calls became less frequent. The 1990s arrived with technological changes that felt like science fiction. Personal computer, the internet, cell phone. The world was speeding up, connecting in unprecedented ways. But for Jessica's family, time had a different quality. Slow, thick. Each year another layer of sediment, burying the hope that their daughter and sister would ever come home. By the mid-1990s, Jessica would have been a teenager, 13, 14, 15. Her mother tried to imagine it sometime, what Jessica would look like now, what kind of person she would be becoming. But the 4-year-old in the photographs remained frozen in time, smiling a smile that would never age, wearing clothes that would never go out of style because they already belonged to another era entirely. The mobile home park, where they had lived the night of the abduction, eventually became unbearable. Too many memories soaked into the wall. The family moved, trying to escape geography as if location was the problem. But grief is portable. It came with them, set up residence in a new place, rearranged itself among new rooms, but remained fundamentally unchanged. Lexington County itself was changing, growth and development creeping outward from Columbia, transforming rural areas into suburbs, bringing chain restaurants and shopping centers where fields used to be. New families moved in, unaware of the history beneath their feet. To them, it was just another nice place to raise children. They didn't know that 30 years earlier, a child had been stolen from her bed and never found. The 2000s brought another wave of technological advancement. Social media, true crime forum, cold case websites where amateur sleuths traded theories and studied decades-old evidence. Jessica's case appeared on some of these sites. Strangers thousands of miles away learned her name, studied her photograph, speculated about what might have happened. For some in the family, this renewed attention felt invasive. For others, it was a strange comfort, proof that Jessica hadn't been completely forgotten, that somewhere people still cared enough to wonder. But online theories don't solve crime, and as the 20th anniversary approached, then passed, the case seemed destined to remain forever in suspension. Jessica's mother was aging now, carrying not just grief, but the accumulated weight of 2 decades of unanswered questions. Her other children had grown up, moved away, started their own family. Life had continued, because that's what life does, but the ache remained constant. By 2010, Jessica would have been 28 years old enough to have children of her own, old enough for her mother to have been a grandmother. These phantom futures haunted the family, all the possibilities that existed in parallel to reality they inhabited. The case file at the Lexington County Sheriff's Office gathered dust, not from neglect, but from the simple fact that there was nowhere new to go. The evidence had been examined and re-examined. The fingerprints had been run through every available database. The leads had been exhausted. Without new information, there was nothing to investigate. And then, slowly, something began to shift. The 2010s brought advances in forensic technology that would have seemed impossible in 1986. DNA analysis became exponentially more sophisticated. Fingerprint databases expanded and improved. Computing power allowed for comparisons that would have taken years to do manually. Cold case units across the country began reopening old files, applying new tools to old evidence. In South Carolina, the State Law Enforcement Division, SLED, had been building its cold case capability. Detectives trained in modern forensic techniques began reviewing files from the 1980s and 90s, looking for cases that might benefit from contemporary analysis. The Jessica Gutierrez case caught their attention, not because of new leads or witness statements, but because of what had been collected in 1986. Fingerprint, specifically, a fingerprint lifted from the window that had been broken to gain entry to the Gutierrez home. It had been documented, preserved, run through the databases available at the time. But in 1986, those databases were limited. Many prints weren't digitized yet. Many offenders hadn't been fingerprinted. The system had gaps that time and technology would eventually close. In 2020, as the world grappled with the pandemic and society seemed to pause, cold case investigators quietly continued their work. The Jessica Gutierrez file was pulled from storage. The evidence was re-examined with fresh eyes and modern tools. The fingerprint from the window, carefully preserved for 34 years, was submitted for another analysis. This time, the database was different, larger, more comprehensive, enhanced by decades of additional criminal fingerprint, better imaging technology, more sophisticated matching algorithm. In the fall of 2021, a notification appeared on a detective screen. After 35 years of silence, the fingerprint had found a match. But then after all those years, something changed. The South Carolina Law Enforcement Division's cold case unit operated from offices that looked nothing like the crime dramas on television. No dramatic lighting, no conspiracy boards with red string connecting photographs, just fluorescent lights, computer screens, filing cabinets holding decades of accumulated tragedy. The detectives who worked there understood that cold cases demanded a different kind of patience. You didn't solve them through brilliance or intuition. You solved them through persistence, technology, and occasionally luck. Detective Sergeant Sarah Chen had been assigned to the Gutierrez case in early 2021. She was part of a new generation of investigators who had never known policing without DNA analysis, without digital databases, without the technological scaffolding that had transformed forensic science. But she also understood that sometimes the simplest evidence, a fingerprint properly preserved, could be more valuable than any sophisticated technique. The notification came through on a Tuesday morning in October 2021. A fingerprint match. Confidence level high. The print lifted from the window frame at the Gutierrez mobile home in 1986 had been matched to a man named Thomas Eric McDowell. Chin stared at the screen for a long moment. 35 years. A child missing for 35 years. And suddenly, a name. She began building the profile. Immediately, Thomas Eric McDowell, born 1962, which would have made him 23 or 24 in June of 1986. Last known address in South Carolina. She pulled his criminal history. There were entries, enough to have gotten his fingerprints into the system, enough to suggest someone who had been in law enforcement's orbit before, but nothing that immediately explained why he would have broken into a mobile home and taken a 4-year-old child. The connection emerged slowly. McDowell had been an acquaintance of Jessica's mother. Not close, but known. Someone who had perhaps been to the home before. Someone who would have understood the layout, known where the children slept, recognized an opportunity in that broken window, an open door. Shun called her supervisor. Then she called the Lexington County Sheriff's Office. By afternoon, a task force had assembled. The investigation was no longer cold. The first step was finding McDowell. In the decade since Jessica's disappearance, he had moved through several addresses, several relationships, several jobs. He had continued living an ordinary life while somewhere a family waited for answers about their 4-year-old daughter. The cognitive dissonance was difficult to process. How someone could carry that knowledge, that crime, and continue functioning normally for 35 years. But investigators had seen it before. The banality of evil, the capacity of human beings to compartmentalize, to justify, to continue existing after committing the unthinkable. They found McDowell in February 2022. He was 60 years old now, nearly twice the age he had been the night he broke into the Gutierrez home. When officers arrested him, he showed no surprise. Some suspects performed shock, confusion, innocent. McDowell simply went quiet, as if he had always known this moment would come eventually. The arrest made headlines immediately. Local news, then regional, then national. Arrest made in 1986 cold case abduction. Fingerprint leads a suspect after 36 years. The story had everything that captures public attention. A child victim, decades of mystery, a technological breakthrough, justice finally arriving. But for Jessica's family, the arrest brought complicated emotion, not celebration, not yet, because the arrest raised questions that had been suspended for 36 years. Questions they had tried not to think about, because the answers were too terrible to imagine. Where was Jessica? McDowell's arrest was one thing, but without a confession, without knowing what had happened that night, the family remained trapped in the same limbo they had occupied for decades. The fingerprint proved he had broken in, had taken their daughter, but it didn't tell them where she was now or if recovery in any form was even possible. The investigators worked carefully. They knew they had one chance to do this right. McDowell had lived with his crime for 36 years. He wouldn't give up information easily. They searched properties associated with him. They interviewed people who had known him in 1986. They built a timeline of his movements in the days and weeks following Jessica's disappearance. The evidence painted a terrible picture. Jessica had been taken, and she had never come home. The investigative team, with the wave of experience behind them, understood what that likely meant. Child abductions that extend beyond the first 24 hours rarely end with recovery. After 36 years, they weren't looking for a missing person. They were looking for remains. The searches intensified through the spring of 2022. Ground-penetrating radar, cadaver dog, excavations at sites connected to McDowell's history. The local news covered each development, but investigators withheld specifics. Some details needed to be protected for the eventual prosecution. Jessica's mother, now in her 60s, her life bookended by hope and grief, waited for each update. The phone calls came regularly now, not with good news exactly, but with progress. After 36 years of silence, progress felt like something. The legal process ground forward. McDowell was formally charged: kidnapping, murder, first-degree burglary. The charges were based on the fingerprint evidence, the timeline, the circumstantial case that investigators had built around that single concrete fact: his print on the window, his presence in that home the night Jessica vanished. The case was assigned to the prosecutor's office. Pre-trial motions began. Defense attorneys challenged the evidence, argued about the reliability of decades-old fingerprint analysis, questioned whether their client could receive a fair trial after so much time had passed. But the physical evidence was solid. The fingerprint had been properly collected, properly preserved, properly analyzed. It didn't lie. In the months leading up to trial, a strange thing happened. The community of Lexington County, which had slowly forgotten Jessica Gutierrez over the decades, suddenly remembered. Her photograph appeared everywhere again, on news broadcasts, in newspapers, shared across social media. A new generation learned her name. True crime podcasts devoted episodes to the case. The story took on a second life, reaching people who hadn't been born in 1986, who couldn't imagine a world where child abductions weren't immediately broadcast through Amber Alerts and social media, where forensic technology was still finding its footing. But beneath the public fascination, the family prepared for trial, for finally hearing, in official legal terms, what had happened to Jessica, for facing the man who had taken her. For 36 years, Thomas Eric McDowell had been a name they didn't know, an anonymous specter responsible for their pain. Now he had a face, a history, a life that had continued uninterrupted, while theirs had shattered. The revelation that he'd been an acquaintance, someone who had known the family, who might have smiled at Jessica, who had then violated that trust in the most unthinkable way, added another layer of betrayal. The danger hadn't come from a stranger in the night. It had come from someone who had walked among them, someone who had been trusted enough to know where they lived, how they lived. The trial date was set for February 2024, nearly 38 years after Jessica's disappearance. Justice, when it finally arrives, rarely comes quickly. February 2024 arrived cold and gray. Winter in South Carolina is mild by northern standards, but there's a particular quality to it: damp, penetrating, the kind of cold that settles into bones and refuses to leave. The courthouse in Lexington County prepared for what everyone knew would be a heavily attended trial. Media representatives requested credentials. Victim advocates coordinated with the family. The community, which had lived with this story for nearly 4 decades, prepared to finally hear its conclusion. Jessica's family arrived early on the first day. Her mother, now 64 years old, walked into the courtroom carrying photographs of her daughter, for years old forever, smiling in images that had been touched and studied and wept over for 38 years. Other family members surrounded her. Jessica's sister, now in her 40s, who had last seen her sister sleeping beside her in 1986. Extended family who had watched this tragedy unfold across decades. They took their seats and waited. When Thomas Eric McDowell was led into the courtroom, the moment carried a sickening weight. Here was the man. Here was the answer to 38 years of questions. He was 61 years old now, bearing the physical markers of time: gray hair, lined face, the ordinariness of a person who could be anyone's neighbor, anyone's co-worker. There was no visible mark of monstrosity, just a man who had committed monstrous act. The prosecution's case was methodical. They began with June 5th, 1986. The mobile home, the family sleeping inside, the window broken sometime in the night. They presented crime scene photographs that had yellowed with age but retained their power: the shattered glass, the small bed, the open front door. They established the layout, the timeline, the terrible efficiency of the crime. Then came the fingerprint evidence. Expert witnesses explained the science, how prints are unique, how they're collected, how they're preserved. They presented the print lifted from the window frame in 1986, and a comparison to McDowell's known print. 17 points of comparison. No doubt his hand had touched that window. His hand had been part of the break-in that led to Jessica's disappearance. The prosecution built a circumstantial case around that core fact. McDowell's connection to the family, his presence in Lexington County, his access and knowledge. The testimony was clinical, factual, letting the evidence speak for itself. But underneath every word was the unspoken reality. A 4-year-old child had been taken and had never come home. The defense did what defense attorneys do. They challenged the age of the evidence, questioned whether a fingerprint on a window definitively proved involvement in a kidnapping, suggested other scenarios. But the case was strong, too strong. The fingerprint was irrefutable, and everything else built naturally from it. Witnesses testified. Law enforcement officers who had worked the original case in 1986, now retired. Their voices thick with emotion as they recounted the morning of June 6. Modern investigators who had reopened the case, who had felt the electricity of that fingerprint match after 35 years. Forensic experts who explained their methodology. Jessica's mother took the stand. She spoke quietly about her daughter, about bedtime routines and favorite foods and the sound of Jessica's laugh, about waking that morning to discover her child gone, about 3 decades of waiting, hoping, grieving without closure. She did not look at McDowell. She spoke to the jury, to the court, to history itself. The testimony lasted 3 days. The deliberation less than 5 hours. On February 14th, 2024, Valentine's Day, a holiday celebrating love, the verdict was read. Guilty. Guilty of murder. Guilty of kidnapping. Guilty of first-degree burglary. On all counts, guilty. The courtroom responded with muted emotion, some tears, some exhaled breaths. No celebration. This wasn't victory. This was simply the end of waiting. Justice, delivered nearly 4 decades late, couldn't restore what had been lost. It couldn't give Jessica's mother back the years of her daughter's life. It couldn't erase the decades of not knowing, of empty birthdays and unanswered prayers. But it was something. After 38 years, it was finally something. The sentencing hearing followed. The judge spoke about the severity of the crime, about the unimaginable pain inflicted on a family, about the theft of a child's future and a family's peace. 2 life sentences to be served consecutively. Thomas Eric McDowell, now 61 years old, would spend the rest of his life in prison. The courtroom emptied slowly. Media rushed to file reports. Family members embraced, cried, struggled to process what they had just witnessed. Outside, the February cold continued. The world kept turning. In the days following the verdict, the community of Lexington County processed the conclusion of a story that had haunted them for nearly 40 years. The local newspaper ran retrospective. How the case had begun, how it had gone cold, how modern technology had finally provided answers. Social media filled with reaction from those who remember 1986 and those learning the story for the first time. But beneath the public response, something quieter was happening. Jessica's family was learning to live in a world where the question had finally been answered. For decades, they had existed in suspension, unable to fully grieve because hope refused to die. Now that hope had been replaced with terrible certainty. Jessica wasn't coming home. She never would. But they knew what had happened. They knew who was responsible, and that knowing, painful as it was, allowed for something they hadn't experienced in 38 years, closure. The family held a memorial service in March 2024, not a funeral. There were no remains to bury, no body to lay to rest, but a memorial, a formal acknowledgement of loss, a chance for the community to gather and speak Jessica's name. They released balloons, read poems, shared memories from those who had known her in the brief 4 years she lived. People who had been children themselves in 1986 came, now middle-aged, carrying their own memories of the case that had defined their childhood understanding of danger and loss. Jessica's sister, who had carried the burden of being the one who survived, the one who woke to find her sister gone, spoke about forgiveness, not forgiving McDowell, but forgiving herself for the guilt she had carried for 4 decades. A child's irrational but persistent belief that she should have somehow prevented the unpreventable. The memorial service wasn't just about Jessica. It was about all the people whose lives had been shaped by her absence. The mother who had lived in limbo for 38 years. The siblings who had grown up in the shadow of loss. The investigators who had carried the case across decades. The community that had never quite forgotten, even when the world moved on. In the months following the verdict, Lexington County began to heal in small ways. The case that had lingered as an open wound, a reminder of vulnerability and uncertainty, had finally been resolved. Not happily. There are no happy endings when a child is killed, but resolved. The question that had hung in the air for nearly 4 decades had been answered. For Jessica's mother, healing looked different. At 64, she had spent more of her life missing her daughter than raising her. For years of Jessica's presence, 38 years of her absence, the math was cruel. But with the verdict, with the certainty, came a strange kind of peace. She could finally stop waiting. She could finally fully grieve. She continued to mark the dates. Jessica's birthday in December, the anniversary of her disappearance in June. But now, they had a different quality. Not suspended hope, but remembrance. Memory honoring what was, not what might have been. The case also sparked broader conversations about cold case investigation, about the importance of preserving evidence, about how technological advances can reach back through time to deliver justice decades after crimes were committed. Jessica's case became a teaching tool, a reminder to investigators that cases are never truly cold if the evidence has been properly maintained. In South Carolina, SLED's cold case unit continued its work, emboldened by the successful resolution of the Gutierrez case. Other families who had waited for their own answer felt renewed hope. If justice could come after 38 years, perhaps it could come for them too. The trial also forced uncomfortable conversations about trust and danger. McDowell had been an acquaintance, someone known to the family. His crime violated not just physical safety, but social trust. It reminded communities that danger often comes not from strangers, but from those closest to us, from people who exploit familiarity to cause harm. Throughout it all, Jessica remained at the center, not as a victim, though she was that, but as a person, for years old, loved, missed. Her life, however brief, mattered. Her absence created a hole that could never be filled, but could finally be acknowledged fully. The photographs that Jessica's mother had carried into the courtroom were eventually placed in a memorial album. Jessica at 1, at 2, at 3, at 4, frozen in time but preserved in memory. The album became a way to introduce Jessica to grandchildren who would never meet her, to keep her present even in absence. As 2024 continued, the immediate intensity of the trial faded. Media moved on other stories. The public's attention, always fleeting, shifted to new mysteries, new tragedy. But for Jessica's family, the story didn't end with a verdict. They continued living with her absence, now recontextualized, now understood, but still felt. Sometimes healing isn't about feeling better. Sometimes it's just about understanding what you're feeling, why it hurts, what was lost. The verdict didn't restore Jessica, but it named what had been done to her. It assigned responsibility, and it ensured that the person who had stolen her life would lose his own freedom. It was the only justice available in an unjust world. In Lexington County, life continued. New families moved into developments that didn't exist in 1986. Children played in parks without knowing the history that preceded them. But among those who remembered, who had lived through the long years of uncertainty, Jessica's name remained, a reminder, a memorial, a life that mattered, even in its terrible brevity. In the end, this case reminds us that justice has no expiration date. 38 years passed between the night Jessica Suzanne Gutierrez was taken from her bed and the day her kidnapper was held accountable. 38 years of waiting, wondering, carrying the unbearable weight of not knowing. For most of our lives, we mark time in conventional ways, birthdays, anniversaries, milestones. But for families of the missing, time moves differently. Each day is both a continuation of grief and a faint hope that answers might finally come. The resolution of Jessica's case wasn't a miracle. It was a result of meticulous preservation of evidence, technological advancement, and investigators who refused to accept that cold meant closed. It demonstrates something profound about the nature of justice. It may be delayed, diverted, or deferred, but properly pursued, it cannot be permanently denied. We must also acknowledge what justice cannot do. It cannot restore what was lost. It cannot give Jessica's family back the decades they spent in limbo. It cannot erase the trauma or heal all wounds, but it can provide answers. It can assign accountability. It can ensure that those who commit terrible acts eventually face consequences, no matter how much time passes. For every family still waiting for answers about their missing loved one, Jessica's case offers both hope and a challenge. Hope that advances in forensic science can reach back through time to deliver justice. A challenge to investigators, to communities, to society itself. Never stop searching. Never stop trying. Never let time erase the moral imperative to seek truth. Jessica Suzanne Gutierrez was 4 years old. She loved her family. She slept next to her sister. She deserved to grow up, to have birthdays, to experience life. Thomas Eric McDowell stole all that from her, and in doing so, stole decades of peace from everyone who loved her. The verdict in February 2024 could not restore what was taken, but it could and did affirm a fundamental principle that every life matters, that every victim deserves justice, and that society will not forget. There is something profoundly important about speaking the names of victims, about ensuring they are remembered not just as cases or statistics, but as people. Jessica Suzanne Gutierrez, 4 years old, gone for 38 years, but never forgotten by those who loved her. Her story is not just about her death, but about her life, brief as it was, and about the persistence of those who refused to let her disappear completely. This case also forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about the world we live in, about how danger can come from familiar faces, from acquaintances we trust enough to allow into our lives, about how quickly safety can be shattered, how a single night can reshape the trajectory of countless lives, about the vulnerability of children and the responsibility we all share to protect them. But perhaps most importantly, Jessica's case reminds us that time does not diminish justice's importance. 38 years is more than a generation. Children born the year Jessica disappeared were middle-aged by the time her case was resolved. The world changed dramatically. Technology, culture, politics, everything transformed. But the moral imperative to seek justice for a murdered child remained constant. The fingerprint that solved this case was lifted in 1986 by investigators who couldn't have imagined how long it would take for that evidence to yield answers. They did their job properly, preserved the evidence carefully, and unknowingly laid the groundwork for justice that would come decades later. Their professionalism mattered. Their diligence mattered. Every piece of evidence collected, every protocol followed, every detail documented. It all mattered for investigators working cases today. Jessica's story is a reminder that their work has implications stretching far into the future. The evidence they collect now, the care they take in preservation, the thoroughness of their documentation, all of it might be the key that unlocks justice years or decades from now, when technologies we can't yet imagine make new solutions possible. For families living in the anguish of not knowing what happened to their loved one, this case offers a complex gift, not false hope, hope that ignores reality, but genuine hope grounded in the knowledge that cases can be solved after extraordinary lengths of time, that forensic science continues to advance, that somewhere an investigator might be reviewing a cold case file, applying new tools to old evidence, getting one step closer to answer. But it also requires acknowledging a difficult truth. Not all cases will be solved. Not every family will get the closure Jessica's family finally received. Some questions will remain unanswered. Some perpetrators will never be caught. Some evidence will prove insufficient even with advancing technology. The possibility of justice doesn't guarantee justice. It only guarantees a continued pursuit of it. The day Thomas Eric McDowell was sentenced to 2 consecutive life terms, Jessica's mother told reporters that she could finally breathe. After 38 years of holding her breath, of living in suspended animation between hope and despair, she could exhale. The weight hadn't disappeared. It would never disappear. But its nature had changed. She knew what had happened. She knew who was responsible. She knew he would never walk free again. That knowing matters more than those who haven't lived through such trauma might understand. The human mind is not built to tolerate prolonged uncertainty about the fate of loved ones. It creates a psychological purgatory, an inability to move forward or backward, a frozen state that time alone cannot thaw. Only answers can do that, even terrible answers, even answers that confirm fears and destroy hope, because at least they allow for the beginning of genuine healing. In the years to come, Jessica's story will be told and retold. It will appear in true crime documentaries, in academic papers about cold case resolution, in training materials for forensic investigators. Each retelling serves a purpose, keeping her memory alive, educating about the possibilities of justice, inspiring others to never give up on unsolved cases. But beneath all those retellings, beneath the public narratives and the media coverage and the legal proceedings, there remains the simple, devastating truth at the heart of this story. A 4-year-old girl was taken from her bed and never came home. A mother lost her daughter. A sister lost her sibling. A family was shattered in ways that 38 years and a guilty verdict could never fully repair. Jessica never got to start kindergarten, never lost her first tooth, never learned to ride a bike or read a book or dream about what she wanted to be when she grew up. She never experienced adolescence, never fell in love, never had children of her own. All of those possibilities, all of those futures were stolen on a humid June night in 1986 by someone who had no right to them. And yet, in the face of that unspeakable loss, Jessica's family persevered. They continued living even when life felt impossible. They held on to hope even when hope seemed irrational. They trusted that someday, somehow, answers would come. And after 38 years, they did. That perseverance mattered. It testifies to the resilience of the human spirit, to the power of love to endure beyond death and absence, to the refusal to let tragedy have the final word. Jessica's family could have given up. They could have stopped hoping, stopped believing that justice might eventually arrive. No one would have blamed them. 38 years is longer than most people's entire careers, longer than many marriages, longer than childhood and adolescence combined. But they didn't give up. And when that fingerprint match came through in 2021, when investigators called to say they finally had a suspect, their persistence was validated. Justice may have been delayed, but it was not denied. As this story concludes, we return to where we began, that night in June 1986 when a window broke and a door opened and a child vanished into darkness. We cannot change what happened. We cannot restore what was lost, but we can ensure it is remembered. We can ensure that Jessica Suzanne Gutierrez is more than a case file, more than a cautionary tale, more than a statistic in discussions about cold case resolution. She was a person, a daughter, a sister, a child who deserved to grow up. Her life mattered then, and it matters now. And the justice finally delivered in 2024, however delayed, affirms that truth. Every life matters, every victim deserves justice, and time will not erase our moral obligation to seek truth. For all the families still waiting, still hoping, still living in the terrible uncertainty of not knowing, Jessica's case stands as proof that answers can come even after decades of silence, that forensic science continues to evolve, that somewhere an investigator might be applying new technology to old evidence, getting closer to the truth. And for all of us, whether directly touched by such tragedy or observers from a distance, this case reminds us why justice matters, not just for punishment or deterrent, but for affirmation that society values every life, that crimes do not disappear simply because time passes, that we will continue seeking truth no matter how long it takes. Justice may come late, but if pursued with diligence and determination, it does not vanish. It waits patiently for technology to advance, for evidence to speak, for the right piece of the puzzle to finally fall into place. 38 years after Jessica Suzanne Gutierrez was taken from her home, justice arrived. Late, but not too late to matter. Her story is now complete. Not the way anyone hoped it would end, but complete nonetheless. The questions have been answered. The responsible party has been held accountable, and a family, after nearly 4 decades of waiting, can finally begin the difficult work of healing. Jessica's life was brief, but her impact extends far beyond those 4 years. She changed her family forever. She challenged investigators for decades. She became a symbol of persistence, of the pursuit of justice against impossible odds. And now, her case offers hope to others still waiting for their own answers, still believing that someday, somehow, truth will emerge from the darkness. In a mobile home in Lexington County, South Carolina, on June 6, 1986, time stopped for one family. On February 14, 2024, in a courthouse in that same county, time began moving again, not backward. Nothing could restore what was lost, but forward, finally, into a future shaped not by uncertainty, but by truth. This is a legacy of Jessica Suzanne Gutierrez, that even 38 years later, even after hope seemed foolish and justice seemed impossible, the truth emerged, and in emerging, it affirmed something essential about humanity, that we do not forget our children, we do not abandon our pursuit of justice, and we do not allow time to erase our moral obligation. Every case solved, no matter how long after the crime, sends a message to victims' families and to perpetrators alike. Justice may be delayed, but it will not be denied. Technology will improve. Investigators will persist. Evidence will speak. And eventually, the truth, however long buried, will come to light. For Jessica Suzanne Gutierrez, that light finally came. For years old forever, but remembered always, gone but not forgotten. A victim, yes, but also a catalyst for persistence, for hope, for the belief that justice, however delayed, remains worth pursuing. Her story ends here, 38 years after it began, with the only justice possible in an irreparably broken situation, the truth acknowledged, accountability assigned, and a family finally able to say goodbye to the waiting and hello to the painful but necessary work of moving forward. Rest in peace, Jessica Suzanne Gutierrez. Your life mattered, your story mattered, and the justice finally delivered in your name matters, not just for you and your family, but for every victim still waiting for their truth to emerge from the darkness.